Hi there and welcome to Nexford News Network, where today we're extremely privileged to be talking to Lou Pugliese. Mr. Pugliese is an education entrepreneur, senior advisor for Boston Consulting Group Employment and Welfare, and part of Nexford's board of directors. Welcome to you, Lou, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here.
Lou, let's just jump right in and ask you your first question that we want to hear of you. So you've been in higher ed for over 2 decades now. So what would you describe are the biggest challenges facing the sector today? And how have these evolved over time?
Yeah, I think it's, obviously starting with the major problem that we have today is equity and access and trying to provide the type of education that's needed on an individualized basis for those that just don't necessarily have access. And we're not designed as traditional higher education to be able to serve global markets. It tends to sort of be oriented towards those that can afford it, those markets that have the right type of economic conditions that can provide high quality education, but the remainder of the world is left unattended. So certainly the rising cost of quality education, and especially the impact upon graduates into the workforce, have been, traditionally not that effective. The burden, just the administrative cost burden to run a traditional campus leaves many out of the equation, and the increasing costs are commanding ticket prices that are percentages well above that we would see in traditional brands and Apple and Google and any other type of consumer product. Is radically different. It's radically overpriced when compared to what people spend for traditional goods, and we have a habit of continuing to increase prices, but not necessarily change how the system is manufacturing education and the machine that's required to do that.
Going through with regards to the point about education and moving that forward a little bit, there are a lot of naysayers out there that says they are saying that in 2023, a college education or a university education is no longer relevant or important. Our view at Nexford is that it's actually becoming more relevant than ever, given the importance of learning how to learn and continuous reskilling. What is your view on that?
So I think firstly, we tend to look at education as a series of silos. You do primary and secondary education, you do secondary to undergraduate, graduate degrees, and then workforce. And I think the problem is that we don't necessarily look at that as a continuum. So we continue to act in a siloed environment, and in that environment, a degree will continue to be important for specific programs and specific skills that are required by workforce, no doubt. I think a degree augmented by different methods to be able to acquire that degree or augment that degree will also be increasingly important. And you can see that today. It's not a question of a degree versus not have a degree. It's a question of how you orient that formal education and validate that formal education toward a particular skill and job role within any corporate environment. And so, yes, degrees will continue to be important for those areas that will require it from a compliance perspective, from a competency perspective, and what corporations and employers are wanting to do and strategically, and their contribution to the economic development region or global impact that they're trying to create. So I think it's more about honing the degree down to those specific areas of need that are going to drive economic development, and then looking at how we break the silo of education, these individual silos, with continuous upskilling and reskilling.
Right, some very interesting points made there, so thanks for that. Your CV reads like the who's who, so you've worked with some of the largest higher ed institutions in the US. So how would you describe the gap that still exists in the market, and how do you think Nexford might be positioned to fill that gap?
Sure. So traditional higher education is really built around this monolithic design of imparting knowledge and not necessarily skills. They're not designed for specific skills. When I was running a major university, these were generic degrees that provided skills we think were useful, but they weren't necessarily linked to these hundreds of thousands of job skill role taxonomies and ontologies. There was no real precision around what a student learns in a particular course of study or a degree and how that applies in a granular way to a skill that they need that's predicted to be successful in a particular job role, skill, and workforce. And so we have to re-engineer and retool the entire academic curriculum around that. Institutions aren't inherently designed for graduating students into careers for specific targeted job skill roles. We're also not, in terms of traditional higher education, not designed well to serve the needs of what we call the new majority learner. And those are learners that are currently in the workforce that need new skills. We're talking about immigrants that in global knowledge are, transitioning in and out of countries for their education. Certainly the underserved in equity and access. All of this new demographic is really challenging for higher education, traditional higher education institutions to be able to redesign their curriculum around what we call this new majority learner. And this is now mainstream. This is now the major portion of the demographic of students that are being educated at universities are not traditional students that are coming out of secondary school and transitioning from secondary to post-secondary education. I would also say that we're designed around highly populated, high economic development markets in education globally. It's not necessarily designed to serve emerging markets and underserved communities that provide affordable education in ways that impact regional economic development. And those regions are unique. Every region is very unique in terms of their economic development needs and how education can move the needle in those high job skill roles that are needed in those particular economic development regions. And many of them are very different. Some of them have similar characteristics. Where Nexford is in particular, in Eastern Africa, there are a lot of similarities to the remainder of the country in sort of changing the dynamic between how those countries are typically, their GDP is derived around agrarian communities and not necessarily around technology, for instance. So there's a huge opportunity in those regions as we have aging populations around agrarian populations to be able to change the economic dynamics through education in those regions.
Yeah, it's all about competency-based learning, and Nexford we prioritize skills over theory. So it's interesting points that you make there. You've been an Nexford supporter and board member from our earlier days when we were just getting started. We know impact has always been a priority for you. So in what ways do you think Nexford can positively impact the world?
Well, again, just bridging from the answer to the last question, I think Nexford is one of the now few accredited universities that are addressing the profound need for access and equity in education for those particular regions, designed for those particular regions from an undergraduate and graduate program perspective. And while Nexford has a set of unique types of degrees available, the ability to be able to expand into new degrees based on those successful models that Nexford has already been successful at is a high probability for success to build in and continue to expand those program offerings. I think that major new world economies are dependent, obviously, on a skilled workforce in those specific areas. The problem we have today globally is creating and retaining qualified middle skills and high in-demand professional staff that are required in these corporations that drive new business and impact, economic development in those regions. So major global regions cannot access the type of education that are really uniquely designed for those regions to create, retain, and upskill the workforce in these emerging markets to create sustainable economic development that impacts in long-term GDP in those regions. I don't know of any other university that's really designed to do that at scale. And so I think Nexford value proposition is really that uniqueness about how to serve those regional communities.
Fantastic. And at Nexford, we're always looking to put higher learning into the hands of the many, not just the privileged few. So we often talk about the global grid, and we see a day when one's physical location, age, gender, or even race will no longer deter their ability to move forward in life. Do you see the world truly moving in this direction? Is it something that's current right now?
I think it's one of the major challenges. If you look at World Economic Development, ESG goals, those are very, very challenging goals for uplifting those specific regions that are low in economic development and are in most need. So I think it's about program design. It's certainly about affordability and access, but it's also about building the founding premise, which Nexford has, assuming that everyone has the capacity and the ability to learn at certain levels. And so many students or potential contributors are left behind because we assume that only certain demographics or certain economic levels within those regions have the ability to learn and get degrees, and that's just simply not true. Everybody has the capacity to learn and contribute, and we need to continue to design programs around that. And I think Nexford is one of the unique universities that has the ability to expand at looking at who are those populations that have something to contribute and have the capacity to learn, and how do we reach them?
Great stuff. And we've seen obviously post-COVID that remote working is here to stay, and there's a lot of companies that are adopting this model of working. So we at Nexford see a growth in remote jobs as a massive opportunity for social and economic mobility across the world. So how do you think we as a university need to enable such mobility?
So I'll just use a simple example is that, globally, one of the most compelling phenomena is the gig economy. You can get anything, any type of service for any type of business or industry that you want by prospectively a skilled provider. Now, those gig economy environments are going to be increasingly challenged to continue to be sustainable in providing qualified workforce at low cost and high volume output to be able to support the economic development needs of those regions. And so these types of gig economy phenomena need to continue to be sustained. And the most pure, it's really the most pure form of free enterprise and workforce. And so I think Nexford has the unique ability to not only be able to educate B2C and continue to grow that, one, two, be able to work with corporations globally to supply their employee benefit programs to continue to educate their existing staff, and then three, continue to sustain and support new labor markets like the interesting phenomenon of the gig economy. And in order for these economies to sustainable and continue to grow, those continuous skill development programs in real time are going to be able to be required to service those three unique models.
So talking about time and how things evolve and obviously change, this month Nexford's celebrating its 4th anniversary. So where do you see Nexford 4 years from now?
So I would say that my hope and dreams would be that Nexford continues to be and evolves as the preeminent source for affordable, high impact education that supports regional emerging market economies with a qualified labor management solutions that have a high probability of succeeding when a Nexford graduate enters the workforce. There's a significantly high probability of success that employee is going to be successful in that job skill role, and those corporations and those employers that are employing Nexford graduates are getting significant benefit in this strategic advancement of what those organizations are contributing to the world economy. And I would say that, a good benchmark would be, how does Nexford become a major contributor to the World Economic Forum's ESG mandates? And I see a direct proportional relationship between the two and how we can contribute, to those ESG mandates.
One of the words that you used in that answer there that sort of jumped out for me was affordability. So that brings me on to my next question. So why do you think universities in the US are still so expensive and unaffordable to the majority of people? And in your opinion, what do you think is holding them back from offering quality yet affordable education?
Well, I think, traditionally, for the past 300 to 400 years, we continue to hold on to these antiquated models of how to deliver education. And it's really difficult to sort of work these traditional models outside that box. The funding models are very centralized. There's a significant amount of subsidy that happens. That subsidy is decreasing over time. More of the freight of the cost is having to be borne by the individual learner, and so the economic model is relatively flawed. There's high administrative burden around the whole delivery on an on-site physical campus. So I think that what we're going to see over the next decade is the need for a physical campus to continue, but not in the same shape and function that you see today, certainly. The digital teaching and learning environment is going to be increased in a sort of mixed method mode where there's on-campus and online learning, continuing to increase, and then a fully online degree, certainly, increasing over time, and new funding models that are going to emerge, because just the affordability model changes when you look at fully online institutions and mixed hybrid campuses where synchronous learning happens online and on-campus learning happens in physical locations. I think you'll also see a significant amount of distribution of low-cost education in campuses that don't look like the same campuses that higher education typically embodies. So that will change radically, and that's already changing over time.
Fantastic. And then there's a lot of talk these days about the massive chasm or gap that's existing now between what employers are looking for and the skills that employees are able to bring to the table. So sort of for over a decade now, there's been much talk about the gap between higher ed and employer needs. So what do you think is the root cause of this gap, and how can universities bridge it?
So root cause is what I mentioned earlier, is when we think about a traditional degree and how a traditional degree is constructed, what's absent from the equation is really a good understanding of what employers actually need in a job skill role. So there's no precision around that. So we have a big gap between the supply and demand of labor, and you have challenges today because they don't talk the same language. Employers in education talk completely different languages, and the bridge is going to have to be, continuing to evolve over time. You see organizations like Intermediaries Guild and others trying to bridge that gap, but those are really emerging as catalog businesses that are serving employers that basically say, here are all the university relationships that we have relationships with that can supply and plug into your employee benefit programs. But again, those programs are supplied with a degree mentality, and those employees don't need a degree. They need to move from network administration to a coder role, and you can't do that. That requires a degree to do that. And as long as universities are continuing to supply just degree programs and not degree inclusive of non-degree offerings, that gap is going to continue to emerge. So I really think Nexford has a major role to play, especially in these emerging markets, in bridging the supply and demand of a qualified labor marketplace. And so I'd like to see organizations begin to embrace that concept of supply and demand. And future development of Nexford business is not only B2C, but also B2B in solving that labor market demand and placing the organization in the middle of that supply and demand chain.
Thanks. And just sort of going on about the sort of topic about skills and what's in demand and what's short of. Over the past few years, we've seen there's been a race to teach coding skills, whereas employers have been consistently reporting major shortages in so-called soft skills. So what do you view as the skills in demand across employers today?
Yeah, so I think that, first of all, we don't do a good job at really understanding or measuring soft skills or social emotional learning or non-cognitive skills, whatever you want to call it. And it becomes part of the key indicator of whether a future employee is going to be successful in the marketplace. Really looking at the whole learner or the whole employee. And so we have to do a better job at understanding how you integrate things like the big five and those typical labor market soft skills that are required, 21st century skills, along with the hard skills that are required in evaluating the performance of a future employee or being able to predict success. You can't look at it as a singular, how did a student do in a particular coding course, or how did they do specifically in one area of the curriculum, and just judge them on that. We know that successful technology employees, for instance, are those that didn't necessarily get the 4.0 in their computer science program. These are employees that are successful because they have strong social emotional indicators along with their academic skills. So we need to do a better job at assessing and preventing the necessary intervention around those social skills that are especially necessary in the workforce.
Great. And I think in the time that you've been at the university, I'm sure you've seen things sort of flux and change, and things have moved on quite a bit in a short space of time. We were fortunate enough to hear the news recently that we have just received DEAC accreditation. What do you think this means for the university, its learners and graduates?
Well, it certainly is significant in terms of the academic rigor that's required to be able to run a quality university that has high impact. And so the accreditation certainly provides the necessary guideposts that Nexford needs to be able to keep on task in continuing to maintain and increase its academic quality. And so that's the best benchmark, the most rigorous benchmark that one could want, and to provide the confidence among those parties that we are trying to bridge the supply and demand against, to provide the necessary confidence that it's going to continue to provide the high quality, high impact education that's required.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lou, for being with us today and for giving us some real food for thought. We know you're a busy man, so thanks very much for giving up your time.